We grew up with the library. We grew up with the Dewey Decimal System that showed you how to put things in order, in alphabetical order by last names, how to pick your books. We grew up with encyclopedias. That was the big thing. Encyclopedias was the big thing. Encyclopedias was one of those things that everybody wanted in their house, but they couldn't afford. You couldn't afford to have all of the books of the encyclopedia. And the encyclopedia came A through Z. But you couldn't afford the whole thing of the encyclopedia. So to have an encyclopedia was a big thing. We grew up where some of us still had floor model TVs. We grew up where some of us were the remote control. We grew up where the TV went off at a certain time and it would be buzzing because all of shows have ended. We grew up where you would sometimes have to put a piece of paper behind the knob of your TV and use a coat hanger because your TV wasn't acting right to get it to act right for an antenna. We grew up, some of us, where black and white was still popular before color came into play and really came into play. We grew up with shows like Dick Van Dyke, Archie Bunker, The Jeffersons, Sanford and Son, Good Times. We grew up with things like that before all the other shows came along. We grew up with Nintendo. That was a big thing. Nintendo 64. We grew up playing Centipedes. We grew up playing Pac-Man. We grew up when VCRs first came out. And they were so expensive that if you got one VCR, you was considered a big shot because you had a VCR. Your mom and them had a VCR in their home. We grew up when cable first came out. And it had this little flick that would come on sometimes that was called Red Shoe Diary. That would come on late at night. We grew up where on Saturdays we had cartoons and on Sunday you had Sunday matinee. We grew up with Charlie Chan. We grew up with Orson Welles. We grew up with the Flintstones, the grape ape, Yabba Dabba Doo, Scooby Doo. We grew up with those types of things. We grew up with the Jetsons. We grew up with those types of things. So the reason that the lady is telling you this or saying this is because she wants you to understand the timing and the era in which certain things took place. We grew up in a time, in an era where you were put in a catch-22 when it came to adults. A child was always considered to be lying on a grown-up because why would a grown-up do anything such as what a child could possibly be saying? A child was always to be seen and not heard. A child was always told, you're getting in grown folks' business. That let you know you was getting out of hand. A child could get a whooping and they'd make you pick your instrument for a whooping. And what I mean by that, the lady said, is that they take you out and have you get a switch. And a switch is something that came off a tree. They called it a switch, a tree limb, a piece of a tree limb, a little thin piece of a tree limb. And if you came back with a too small of a little flimsy piece, they'd walk you back up there to wherever that tree was that you got it from, and they'll get another one and they'll take the leaves off of it, and you will be getting a whipping with it, and you have little whelps on your behind or on your legs because they're gonna whoop your butt with it. We came up in an era where whippings was the thing that solved everything. Anything that you did, if you got a whooping, you got a whooping, and that solved everything, period, point blank. We grew up in an era where a young woman would start her cycle and she would be told, okay, you can make babies now. And that was all the sex education information that you got. We grew up in an era where sanitary napkins came with a belt that you wore around your waist. And they had this big, thick thing that went from one end of you to the other end of you that you had to wear. And then later on, it graduated to it being able to stick in your underwear. We grew up in an era where if a boy was hitting on you, that was supposed to mean that he liked you. So later on, when you were letting boys hit on you and they couldn't understand why you were letting somebody beat on you or hit on you, well, they told you that if a boy did that, it was because he liked you. We grew up in an era where women didn't get rights until the late 60s, 70s. The right to have our own bank account, the right to have our own job. In fact, we grew up in an era where at one time, if a woman was getting beat on, the police didn't come. Nobody did anything about that. In fact, it was okay. It was looked at as, oh, okay, he beat his wife, so what? We grew up in an era where if the man went to the door and said he was going to the store and he never came back and he was the main provider, that woman and her children would be on the street homeless and hungry.